We'll now get ready to move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's for the Premier. This government has a complicated, perplexed relationship with privacy. This government fails to protect the personal information of FOIPOP users and pharmacy patients, but it's all hands on deck for their own secrets, Mr. Speaker. We were reminded yesterday that the former Minister of Health and the current Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage used a private account to shield communications from the FOIPOP system. The FOIPOP Commissioner is now demanding those emails be made available to her, and rightly so. Will the Premier ensure that the Minister in question complies with the request of the FOIPOP Commissioner?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. I want to inform this House when the situation was brought to the Minister's attention, he acknowledged the fact, Mr. Speaker, that information had been sent from government account to his Gmail account. He has stopped that practice, Mr. Speaker, and now his government work is done on his government account and his constituency work is done on his own account.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, we also remember when the Premier proudly admitted, that he conducts his communications by phone with the express purpose of ensuring it won't fall under Freedom of Information guidelines. He has deliberately pushed the boundaries of his duty to document the decisions he makes and the considerations that go into those decisions. It is no wonder that the former Minister of Health wouldn't take the FOIPOP Commissioner seriously when he sees the example the Premier is setting. So I ask, did the Premier direct his minister to retain the emails that the Commissioner has demanded, and does he know if they even still exist?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. Again, I want to tell when the situation was brought to the Minister's attention, the Minister has acknowledged the mistake and changed practice. I do want to say to the Honourable Member, she's absolutely right. I do a lot of verbal communication. I want to tell her for that we have the highest credit rating, Mr. Speaker, in the history of this province. I want to continue to remind her. I continue to want to remind her that we have grown our exports by $2 billion, Mr. Speaker. I want to continue to remind her that population growth is at an all-time high. I want to tell you we're on the back of 3 successful years of growing the tourism industry. Mr. Speaker, the work continues.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier's, I'm kind of speechless actually, the Premier's disregard for the FOIPOP Commissioner is actually astounding. Really. He says she doesn't need to be an independent officer of this House. Not only does he refuse to comply with her directions and skirt the rules for documentation, but his office directly interferes with the FOIPOP Commissioner's efforts. According to the review report, the Premier's office refused to make staff available for an interview. So I will ask the Premier, would the Premier interfere in similar requests by the Auditor General or the Ombudsman?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the request was made to the clerk. As the Honourable Member knows, she stands in this House many times, would know that the officer does not have this power, Mr. Speaker, to subpoena people as witnesses. She would also know, Mr. Speaker, if she paid attention to the very fact what was asked of the Minister. What was asked of the Minister identified was the issue. We solved the problem. Case was closed, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Well, the email account of which my colleague speaks was under the oversight and care of the then Minister of Health's executive assistant. And when the Information and Privacy Commissioner requested to be able to interview that person, the response she received came from a Deputy Minister in the Premier's office to say that that interview was not going to take place. So the Premier has been asked by my colleague for an explanation, but I don't believe we've heard it for this interference in this investigation.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it was not the Premier's office as you are describing it from the political side, Mr. Speaker. The clerk is also the head of public service. The request was going in to ask for the officer wanted to interview someone she does not have the authority to interview. The clerk, upon looking at that, realized that the very thing she wanted to interview him on had already been dealt with. We actually agreed with the FOIPOP officer that the minister should not be using his personal account. We fixed that problem. The minister acknowledged that. That is what the process was going through, Mr. Speaker. That's why the decision was made by the clerk.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
The Information Commissioner has cautioned that it's possible for personal emails to be wrongly used to provide shield for material from legitimate freedom of information requests. Now, the government, she says, failed in this case to make any effort to comply with a legitimate freedom of information request for personal emails that had been used in the minister's public capacity. And this, she says in her report, was offside and was out of line. Now, the Premier is responsible for the tone, the standard of transparency and forthrightness of the entire administration. So I want to ask, does this behaviour meet the standard that he sets?
Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, what happened was there was a FOIPOP request coming in by an agency, Mr. Speaker. They were looking for an entire year window. What went back to them, can you narrow the scope? They narrowed the scope to 3 months. All of the information and all of the requests that they were looking for was turned over to that applicant, Mr. Speaker. I don't know the number of pages there were, but they were turned over to the applicant who asked for the information, Mr. Speaker. That's how that process works. There was nothing hidden from the person who actually asked for the information. We turned it over to them.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Commissioner Tully has made a number of recommendations flowing out of this investigation, but none of these is binding because her office doesn't have the power to enforce them. And prior to the election, the Premier had said that if elected, this is a quotation, he would expand the powers and mandate of the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner, particularly through granting her order-making powers. And earlier this week, the Premier said this was no longer the view that he takes and that that previous view had been mistaken. But does the Premier understand that his change of heart on this front gives every indication of a person who is being opportunistic about their integrity and selective about honouring their word?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of my track record of dealing with Nova Scotians, communicating directly even when there's difficult information that's required to be handed out, Mr. Speaker. I go and do that on behalf of our government, Mr. Speaker. That is the role that I've accepted. That's the role I asked for, and I'll continue to do so. Mr. Speaker, I want to say to the honourable member, we go through the information, we require the information, we put it out. What the information officer, Mr. Speaker, is looking for, we replied almost all the recommendations she puts forward. We will look at those ones, Mr. Speaker. We go through. We'll continue to make sure that we do that. But I want to go back, Mr. Speaker, to the very the beginning of this particular situation. Was the information officer said to the former Minister of Health and now current Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage, you shouldn't be doing government work on your Gmail account. He agreed. We accepted it. He moved on.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
My question's for the Premier. Just yesterday, actually, the Premier insisted the Privacy Commissioner has all the authority and independence she needs. Well, he said that reasonable governments fulfill the recommendations of the Privacy Commissioner, and so there was no need to make her an officer of the legislature. By the Premier's reasoning, the federal Liberal government, the Liberal government of Prince Edward Island, and the Liberal government in Quebec are not being reasonable. The FOIPOP Commissioner has determined that the Department of Justice lacks sufficient reason to keep secret the documents about the 2014 death of an inmate. She recommended the documents be made available. So I will ask the Premier, will he please be reasonable, release the documents the Privacy Commissioner says the Department of Justice has improperly kept a secret?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Justice continue to have these requests. We have to balance the issue of how do we protect individual privacy, Mr. Speaker, at the same time making the information available that people requested. It's always the balance that we go through. I'm very proud of the work of the Minister of Justice has been doing on behalf of all Nova Scotians, and he'll continue to do so.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
In 2013, the PC Caucus Office submitted a FOIA-POP request to the Department of Community Services asking for information about the government's decision to cancel Phase 3 of the Riverview Adult Residential Facility in Pictou County. Our office received a heavily redacted document, and we appealed the government's heavy-handed approach to keep that information a secret. The FOIA-POP Commissioner agreed with us, saying that to automatically keep draft documents a secret is using the advice to minister exemption too broadly. Despite all of this, the department said it would not abide by the FOIA-POP Commissioner's ruling, which is a shame, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier, once again, please be reasonable, abide by the Privacy Commissioner's ruling and ensure that the Department of Community Services releases all the information about Riverview facility?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Most Nova Scotians know that I'm reasonable all the time, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is we have to strike the balance of making sure that the information that's allowed to go out, Mr. Speaker, can go out, and information that's protecting personal privacy or issues around other aspects that should be kept private, Mr. Speaker, are done so following the regulations in and around the FOIA-POP.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Last night, the CBRM Council passed a resolution reaffirming their support of maintaining rural and community hospitals and actually denouncing the pending closures of New Waterford Consolidated and Northside General. Mr. Speaker, does the Premier want to retract his previous statements characterizing opposition to his decision to close these hospitals as noise?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I'm very proud of the work that we've been doing, Mr. Speaker, going into communities to make sure that they have the appropriate health care infrastructure that meets the needs of that particular community today, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to make sure we modernize health care infrastructure so that we continue to attract new health care professionals into our communities across this province, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to move forward on the work that we've started in Cape Breton.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, progress is not closing facilities. Mr. Speaker, the people of Cape Breton feel they have been abandoned by this government. We start by losing services, and then we lose whole hospitals. We lose doctors to better pay in Halifax. We're losing our kids who can't get treatment for mental health issues at home or with an injured eye. We have to fight tooth and nail to keep anything we want, and we're told that for these hospitals, the decision has already been made. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier apologize to the residents of Cape Breton for his neglect in the health care system in Cape Breton?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, like her government and previous governments, I was not going to allow politics to interfere to do what was appropriate for the people of Cape Breton and ensure to provide them with the appropriate health care infrastructure. The easiest and simplest thing for me to have done would have been to ignore the problem that her party did and her government did. The reality of it is they need new health care infrastructure. We're going to deliver on that commitment, Mr. Speaker. We're going to improve the regional hospital, Mr. Speaker. We're going to ensure that we can retain health care providers to give Cape Bretoners, Mr. Speaker, the health care that they deserve, just like every other Nova Scotian that had been ignored by that party.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today, the FOIA-POP Commissioner made a report available regarding her investigation into the former Minister of Health using private email addresses. In the end, the Privacy Commissioner made 6 recommendations. All 6 are reasonable actions to increase government transparency. Yesterday, the Premier said if a province had a reasonable government, the Premier said if a province has a reasonable government in place, there is no need to give the Privacy Commissioner independence or authority because of a reasonable government will follow through the Commissioner's recommendation. So my question to the Minister of Health is, will the Minister of Health act in a reasonable way and follow all 6 recommendations contained in the Commissioner's report?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would know, there's a report provided just yesterday, I believe, from the Office of the Privacy Officer Mr. Speaker, there will be a response provided to that report in the time frame allotted. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
So, Mr. Speaker, I'll pivot over to the Minister of Internal Services because some of the recommendations talked about her responsibilities. The Commissioner's report detailed at least for occasions when IAP or information access and privacy officials decline to answer questions or refuse to carry out a request of the Office of the Privacy and Information Commissioner investigators. The report says there's a don't tell, don't ask records management philosophy at IAP. That does not sound like the practices of a reasonable government. Will the Minister of Internal Services act immediately to fix the culture at IAP from don't tell, don't ask to one of transparency and openness?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I really would like to thank the member for his question. I want to start off by assuring the member that our staff at IAP provide supports across all government departments. They're available at any time. They work with all departments to make sure that a request that gets put in is answered in the most appropriate fashion as possible. As the Premier stated, as the Minister stated, we have the report. We will review the report, and we will absolutely work to consider all the recommendations from the privacy officer. But I also would like to take the opportunity to talk about how, since our government has come into power, we have worked and advocated for more transparency. We are the first government in the province's history to implement an open data portal where, without looking for information, data is there available and accessible to the residents of Nova Scotia. I also would like to talk about how quickly our FOIPOP request turnaround time has been.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you. I'll go to another question. The province, and this is the Minister of Justice, the province is now engaged in an ongoing court action against a former Department of Justice lawyer. A Toronto Bay Street lawyer is representing the government as well as the Premier and the Attorney General. A FOIPOP request from the PC caucus office asking on how much the Bay Street lawyer is being paid for part of his legal services was refused, and I will table that request. The IAP administrator said our office was not entitled to that information. The big city lawyer is getting paid in taxpayers' dollars, Mr. Speaker. My question to the minister is, why is the minister keeping his bills secret?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to follow up to my colleague's comments, the complexity and volume of FOIPOP requests continue to grow, Mr. Speaker, and over the period of this increase in demand on that service, we continue to hit our 80% target within 30 days, Mr. Speaker. The circumstances of this particular case, I just want to say as well, Mr. Speaker, that there are more applications being completed than previously, Mr. Speaker. There's a higher compliance rate than previous, Mr. Speaker, and there's a lower rate of deemed refusals, Mr. Speaker. This is progress when it comes to freedom of information and protection of privacy.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
The refusal to give legal billing information sets a precedence in secrecy, even for this government. In the past, the PC caucus has requested and received billing information by this government's favourite lawyer, Mr. Jack Graham. The government didn't even put up a fight when we asked for that kind of information. They just handed over Jack's bills. So my question to the minister as well, why are the bills of local lawyers free for the taking, but the government is keeping Bay Street legal bills secret?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. As I indicated earlier, Mr. Speaker, the work that is being undertaken within the FOIPOP policies and mandates are hitting our targets, Mr. Speaker, and we're actually exceeding those targets. We'll continue, Mr. Speaker, with those efforts in vain, always with an open mind to try and improve this particular process.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. Countless Nova Scotians are taking on the role of unpaid family caregiver. Caregivers Nova Scotia says that on average, a caregiver spends 26 hours per week helping a loved one. If caregivers become unable to aid the person needing their help, in too many cases that patient would have no care at all. Caregivers Nova Scotia says that the wait time for home care is still extremely high in this province. As a result, caregivers are getting burnt out. So my question is to the Minister, when can Nova Scotians expect this government to reduce home care wait times and give the caregivers the help they need and deserve?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would know, we've invested heavily in expanding home care services. We've in fact made significant improvement in home care wait times for Nova Scotians looking to or who require these services. Mr. Speaker, in some parts of the province, the wait list has actually been virtually eliminated. And with respect to caregivers in the home, Mr. Speaker, family members or community members providing care, we've actually expanded our supports through the caregiver benefit program, Mr. Speaker, and there's more to come. Thank you.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps you could do a ride-along with some home care workers in Cape Breton, because they're not feeling the same as we're hearing from this minister. Unpaid caregivers not only spend significant time aiding a loved one, but they also administer a wide range of their needs, such as injections, medications, and wound care, to name a few. The problem is a very large portion of caregivers are not professionally trained to take on these tasks. Caregivers Nova Scotia is flooded with calls looking for help, and they can only do so much with very limited resources. So too many delicate procedures are being downloaded to family members who are just trying to look after their loved ones. Will the minister commit to improving home care funding to those who are struggling before an unintended accident happens?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I previously mentioned to the member, two important factors. Number one, we have expanded our investment significantly over the past number of years, each year towards home care services, Mr. Speaker. That's an important part because we've heard from Nova Scotians that they want to stay at home as long as they can, and we need to make sure that we provided the services that were required. We've seen in many parts of the province where the wait list has been virtually eliminated, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to monitor and work with our partners in those services being provided. As I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, earlier this year we expanded the benefit for payment for caregivers in the province, Mr. Speaker, and we have a commitment to do even more. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. In March, the Commission on Inclusive Education released their final report based on hundreds of hours of consultation with thousands of Nova Scotians. The report included a well-researched implementation plan divided into 5 key stages. The timeline for Stage 1 ended August 2018. Despite a significant budget allocation to hire some of the already badly needed specialists, the government seems intent to follow its own agenda and has ignored the other 13 key actions for the first stage. Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain why his government chose to ignore the recommendation to develop Cape Breton and Halifax intensive treatment programs?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member's question. We're moving forward with the report on inclusive education's recommendations. I'm happy to say that we are now at about 95% of our hirings that need to happen to have these additional supports in the system, Mr. Speaker. We're going to keep working at this step by step so that we have a system of education in Nova Scotia that's equitable, that ensures every single student, no matter which part of the province they're being educated in, has the same chance of success, and where special needs supports are delivered consistently in the way that will have the greatest impact on their well-being and achievement. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, this government is following its own agenda and not any review or report. They like to answer every problem with the review or report, but we don't see the implementation. We know from the Commission on Inclusion that our education system is not truly inclusive, and it is not serving anyone as well as it should. Not students, not parents, not teachers, not support staff. This is a complex issue, and we now have a detailed roadmap and a policy framework, but sadly we know that the government has decided not to establish an institute for inclusive education, which would have overseen these efforts. We can't improve the state of inclusive education in this province if we skip Stage 1 of the Commission's implementation plan entirely. Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain why he also chose not to develop an inclusive education policy framework, including new behaviour, mental health and autism strategies and guidelines which are so badly needed?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On the question of the Institute, we are not following through with that recommendation because we want the $1 million it would cost to establish that Institute and continue it annually to actually go into the classroom, Mr. Speaker. To be honest, Mr. Speaker, for that member to suggest we're not following through with the recommendations on the inclusive education report when it's that member, her party, and all members of the opposition who actually voted against the additional dollars that were required to be put in the system, I find completely astounding. That member has voted against every single investment that we've made in education. That member has argued against pre-primary. That member has defended the status quo of a system that she herself has said is failing, Mr. Speaker. And the fact is, no matter what that member says, no matter what those parties try to do to prevent us from achieving our end goals in education, we're going to plow forward and do the very best that we can for our kids.
Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order,
Mr. Speaker, my question is for
the honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture. Over the past while, and especially the last few days, I've received numerous calls from concerned constituents about the situation concerning the Ingonish Ferry breakwater. The ocean water is now flowing into the harbour due to further erosion of the breakwater and is in desperate need of armour stone. If this issue is not addressed, a strong storm surge will most certainly threaten the 17 vessels that are docked there, as well as residential homes, a wetland, and the Cabot Trail connecting Ingonish Ferry to Ingonish Beach. So my question for the Minister is, has the Minister been in contact with the local harbour authority and federal small craft harbour officials to address this situation?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much for the question. And indeed, I have not received correspondence from him at this point, and we would be very interested in getting more information on that question.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this issue has been going on for the last 5 years, but has reached a critical point given the harsher weather conditions our coastlines are experiencing. Fishers have become extremely frustrated navigating the back and forth between both levels of government. The federal government says it's a provincial issue. The Provincial Department of Fisheries said it's a TIR issue. Then it goes back to being a federal issue, and fishers and residents are left wondering who is responsible. So my question to the Minister is, will he commit to working with the local harbour authority as soon as possible to navigate the system and address this critical situation local fishers are experiencing?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much for the question. It's a very important question all over Nova Scotia when the harbours are affected. Most of the time it's the responsibility of DFO and small crafts and harbours, but I'd be willing to work with the member to address this issue and see who is really responsible, see if we can help the fishermen in that regard.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a local question today for the Minister of Transportation. On May the 16th, 2018, a terrible accident occurred at the intersection of Old Sackville and Beaverbank Roads when a vehicle attempted to turn left. A 28-year-old woman who was passenger in the car died at the scene. Subsequent to this fatal accident, there have been 3 other accidents in the same location, all involving vehicles turning left. Since this is a provincially controlled intersection, the Minister and DOT staff did meet with me in May. However, that was 3 months ago since our meeting, and I've had no further updates. My question is, 4 accidents in 4 months is not acceptable. Can the Minister inform this House if his department has reviewed this intersection for a designated left-hand turning lane and a reduction for speed limit in this location?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. I was very pleased to meet with him and one of his other former council colleagues to discuss this matter. And we really are appreciative of these situations when they're brought forward to the department, because our concern, of course, number one, is the priority of the safety of the people who are in the motoring public. We have taken a look at that intersection. The issue of a left turning lane is being reviewed. Sometimes when those happen, if we don't have enough ramp area up to it, it creates more danger than it solves. But I'll be happy to find out where that's at the present time.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, some of the concerns, this intersection is less than 2 kilometers away from 2 schools. There are students walking there. School buses drive by there and turn there daily. It's a high volume of vehicles, over 26,000 cars a day that go through that intersection. The solutions here are neither financially or work intensive. All they require is a reduction in the speed limit in this area and a flashing green light on an already signalized intersection. It continues to be a disaster every day until this is resolved. So can the minister please tell me when his department will be installing a left-hand turn signal at this intersection and lowering the speed limit?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to remind the House that in our most recent budget, we included a significant volume of dollars, $30 million, to review specific safety issues in the province, one of which in this year's allocation is being deployed in the Cape Breton area, which has enabled us to look at particularly difficult circumstances that present themselves as growth occurs, as what has happened in that particular area, and the ability of the highway system to accommodate the growth. So we will look at this particular intersection in view of that safety fund that we have. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question again is the Minister of Health. This government made a promise to Nova Scotians that they would have a family doctor. Sadly, the list continues to grow with each passing day as this government demonstrates their inability to attract doctors. Many of my constituents without a family doctor rely on the emergency room for care, just like many other Nova Scotians across this province. For my constituents who rely on the Northside General Emergency Room, they've been hit hardest as the emergency room has been closed the entire month of August and so far 5 days in September. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister come to North Sydney on September 23rd, share his plan for health care in the Cape Breton Regional Municipality, and take direction from the Minister of Fisheries? And, Mr. Speaker, a reasonable minister would answer just yes or no.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to highlight for the member opposite and for all the House the important work that's ongoing. Mr. Speaker, with the partners of the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the IWK as it relates to recruitment, Mr. Speaker, of primary health care professionals. In the last 18 months, Mr. Speaker, we've recruited about 170 physicians in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. This is in part supported by changes to our incentive programs, Mr. Speaker, changes to our compensation, Mr. Speaker, as well. I'd defer to the member to take a look at a recent release today about the recent success just since April of this year, Mr. Speaker, on recruitment of physicians in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, this is ridiculous. A simple question, a yes or no answer, to get that rambling on. The people that I represent at home, Mr. Speaker, they don't appreciate that. I don't appreciate that, and nobody on this side of the government appreciates that. Mr. Speaker, I asked a simple question to the Minister. Will he come to North Sydney, attend a rally in North Sydney, tell the people what the plan is for health care in Cape Breton, especially on the north side? Mr. Speaker, it's a simple one question, yes or no, please.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can assure the member opposite is that the importance and the priority of this government, Mr. Speaker, myself and the department, our partners, the Nova Scotia Health Authority, the IWK, and other frontline healthcare professionals, is providing the care that Nova Scotians need and deserve in this province, in all parts of the province, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the member opposite, again, as he continues to ask the question, Mr. Speaker, is that we're investing in his community, Mr. Speaker, investing in new infrastructure, we're expanding long-term care facilities, Mr. Speaker, we're investing in regional hospital, Mr. Speaker, to expand cancer care, to expand emergency department access, bringing new infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, which will continue the ongoing efforts for recruitment and retention of physicians in his community.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Since 2013, our province has had a goal of designating at least 13% of our landmass as protected areas. That is a goal the Premier affirmed and highlighted in mandate letters to the Minister of Environment and the Minister of Natural Resources. Advocates were assured that the Liberal government would meet the goal during its first mandate, but the government has failed to deliver on that commitment. We are still sitting at 12.3%, and there has been no action on this file since. So my question for the Premier is, when will this government deliver on its commitment to protect 13% of our landmass?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for the question. She is right. We continue to move towards 13%. I think it's 12.4% now. We have a number of parcels that have been reviewed that are within the departments. Those will be brought forward, Mr. Speaker, after all the assessment is done on them to allow us to move towards and get to 13%.
The Honourable Member for Halifax, Needham.
Mr. Speaker, 90% of the plan's designated areas are just waiting for official protection, which could be done by an order in council. The land, like as in the Wentworth Valley Wilderness area, has already been purchased specifically for the purpose of protection. Why isn't the Premier taking that last step, living up to its commitments on land protection?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier in my question, when a parcel is identified, Mr. Speaker, it goes through a process. The departments are putting through that process. There's a number of parcels of land that are going through that process right now. I expect to see some of them before the Executive Council, Mr. Speaker, in the not-too-distant future. They will then be reviewed and determined, but we're committed to making sure that we get to 13%, and we will do so.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. The Dartmouth General Hospital is currently undergoing millions of dollars in much-needed renovations. I, along with everyone who uses the Dartmouth General, am excited about the renovations taking place and can't wait to see the completed improvements. However, earlier this year, staff told me that none of the millions of dollars allotted to the project will help provide emergency psychiatric care. It remains the only regional hospital in the province without emergency psychiatric care. My question to the Minister is this, Mr. Speaker. Why is the government putting off providing the people of Dartmouth with badly needed emergency psychiatric care?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sure, yourself, the members opposite, that mental health is one of our key priority areas in the province. It's one of the key items within my mandate, Mr. Speaker. We continue to invest heavily in expanding mental health care and supports across the province, Mr. Speaker, in the central zone and all other parts of the province. Indeed, as the member would know, a lot of our efforts has been focused at youth services within communities, Mr. Speaker. We know that the benefits of investing there, particularly mental health, will pay dividends and provide reduce the demands on the more acute areas of our system.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, many hospitals in this province have their emergency departments closed on a regular basis due to a lack of physicians. The Dartmouth General Emergency Department stays open, but they still don't have the capacity to provide the emergency mental health care that patients desperately need. Let's stop and think, Mr. Speaker. What does it say about the state of our health care that my constituents lack proper access to emergency mental health services, and yet I feel fortunate because our ER doesn't close? I'm sure there are members on both sides of this House, Mr. Speaker, that would rather have my problems than the problems facing their communities. My question is this, Mr. Speaker. Is crossing the harbour the only option to Dartmouth residents in need of emergency mental health care? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would know, depending on the nature, mental health, as with our physical health, Mr. Speaker, there are a variety of conditions that one may present with, more or less acute, Mr. Speaker, presenting and being assessed for mental health conditions in an emergency room like in Dartmouth General. Individuals can receive care and support and counselling and directed, Mr. Speaker, to appropriate resources and follow-up, as would be the case for certain physical ailments. Mr. Speaker, when in a crisis, however, all Nova Scotians have access to our crisis line to receive the care and the supports that are needed, Mr. Speaker. People can actually assess and work with them over the phone and make sure the necessary resources are brought to them in those more acute situations as well.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, I hear him talking about how all the investment is being made in Cape Breton Island, how they're going to increase the size of the hospital, how they're going to make more use of the facilities that are there. And I see where the minister himself had to start the clapping because nobody else thinks it's the appropriate way to go forward. Mr. Speaker, I want to say this to that minister. I want to know if he will join the member from Cape Breton Centre, the member from Victoria the Lakes, the member from Northside Westmount, and myself at a rally this Sunday in North Sydney at 2 o'clock.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's recognition and acknowledgement of the investments being made in Cape Breton for the healthcare services. Mr. Speaker, what I assure that member and all members of Cape Breton and across the province is that we do take the care of Nova Scotians, the health care needs, very seriously. That's why we look for opportunities to invest. And Mr. Speaker, we're looking forward. We're looking at the health care needs in these communities, not just for today, but into the future. We're investing for the future of the health care of these communities, Mr. Speaker, providing those needs that'll be met, because for far too long, political parties of all stripes have ignored the needs and the recommendations to deliver the health care that they deserve.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If anybody has ignored the needs of the people of this province, it's that health minister that's over there. 130 plus people, plus doctors are needed. And yet he's signing up and talking about all the doctors they've already recruited. What about all the doctors that are left? What about the 100,000 Nova Scotians that don't have a family doctor, Mr. Speaker? What about them? This minister can come to Cape Breton and tell the people what his plan is, how it's working, and how famous and great he is for what he's not doing for them.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member would know that as of September, over 8,000 Nova Scotians from the Eastern Zone now have primary care access. They're attached to a family physician or primary care practice. That's 8,000 more people, Mr. Speaker, that have family care than previously did. These people, Mr. Speaker, appreciate the investments we've been making. They appreciate the recruitment efforts by the Nova Scotia Health Authority.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
And Mr. Speaker, Cape Bretoners and all Nova Scotians appreciate the investments we're making in our programs, mental health services, Mr. Speaker. They'll appreciate the investments in our infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. And as they know, Mr. Speaker, the recruitment initiatives when primary health care providers have access to the new infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, we know, we've heard from the front line that this will be helpful in recruiting and retaining other health care professionals as well.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll switch over to the Minister of Education, where I know I'm probably going to get a great answer. My question is for the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development. I've asked about the Ecole Wedgeport a number of times. Ecole Wedgeport, of course, is a school of about 100 students in a small Francophone community in my constituency. The community, of course, is very pleased a new school has been announced to replace the current one, so I was wondering if the Minister could give us a little update on where it sits in the construction process.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the first ever multi-year capital plan that the province has engaged with, Wedgeport is on that. We're very happy for that. I know in our community of Yarmouth, and I know that in the members community, people are very excited about this. We're on schedule to have construction begin in 1920 with school opening in 2021. As we enter into this year, the site selection process will begin, and the community will be directly involved in that process and have a chance to express their opinions on best sites possible. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Argyll-Barrington.
Thank you very much. And you know, the community is chomping at the bit. They really want to get to discussing this to find out what's going to be included and not included in their new school. And there's a number of interested community members that would sit on a I guess we used to call them school construction committees, but I know we're not necessarily doing that anymore. So maybe the minister could give us an idea of where that process is and how confident he is that it's going to meet the 2019-2020 construction start date as outlined in the capital plan.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have had a site selection process that has created delays of up to 3 years, so we do have some work to do in terms of improving that process. Because we want these schools to be built on time, unlike past projects that weren't delivered on time to these communities. So we're in the process of finalizing what that's going to look like now, and the community will be involved once we get going with that. But right now, we think we have a 5-year capital plan with 13 schools on there, and we feel very positive about meeting the start and deadlines for each one of those. And I know this is going to be very exciting and important to all the communities that will be impacted.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Energy and Mines. On Tuesday, I asked the Minister of Environment how her department will make sure that Nova Scotia Power is not responsible for another spill like the one in Tufts Cove. She responded that her department leaves that up to the company and only steps in after a spill occurs. This is not a very strong regulatory standard, and it's not reassuring. But if the Department of Environment feels it has no responsibility to prevent further spills, then I'd like to ask the Minister of Energy, is his department or any branch of government doing anything to make sure that Nova Scotia Power does not leak thousands of litres of oil into the harbour again?
The Honourable Minister of Energy and Mines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. We do keep a very close relationship with Nova Scotia Power and other partners in the energy sector. Specific to this situation, we were well aware. Nova Scotia Power informed us immediately. They're taking all the necessary steps as per the Department of Environment. I'm expecting an update from them later today.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, I also asked the Minister of Environment if she could provide further information on why the oil cleanup is going slower than expected. She could not. I asked the Minister of Environment if she could give us a new timeline for when she expects the cleanup to be complete, and she could not. The department seems to be leaving everything to Nova Scotia Power. Maybe we'll hear something more this afternoon. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Energy and Mines, can he or anyone in the government update us on why the cleanup is going slowly and when it will be complete?
The Honourable Minister of Mines and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This situation, of course, the Department of the Environment is the lead, but from the beginning, Nova Scotia Power has been very forthright with information to my department. We've worked very closely with the Department of Environment, and there are a number of steps that Nova Scotia Power needs to take in this situation to ensure that the cleanup is done. As I've said, they've been very forthright with information, and we're expecting an update on that cleanup later today.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of EMO. In a safety or medical emergency, Nova Scotians have been trained to call 911, and we are very lucky to have this service in Nova Scotia. But what happens when there isn't help on the other end of the line? For significant portions of Pictou West, the constituency that I represent, when people use their cell phones to call 911, the call is actually bounced to operators in PEI. I'm sure everyone can see where there's unintended consequences that can result. Is the minister aware of this problem, and does he know how many Nova Scotians may be affected? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have heard in the past that this does happen. I'm not sure how many people are affected by that bounce occurring between towers, but we'll certainly commit to looking at how many that might be. But I've not been made aware of, since I became minister, that there have been any problems to date.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, I'm glad I'm able to address this today, because in these situations, we all know minutes count, indeed actually seconds, and I saw that and witnessed it this summer. To have a call routed across the Northumberland Strait to people who can't help on the other end, and it creates us losing valuable time in order to save someone. It takes long enough, as we know, for help to arrive in such areas as mine and rural areas, and I'd like to know if the Minister plans to create a plan to fix this gap in the 911 system, and if the Minister can tell the House how long it will be until all 911 calls in Nova Scotia are answered actually in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having worked previously in the EMS world, I know what that feels like to be responding and to take those calls, having worked in the centre where that happens. I do know the good folks at 911 are working hard. They bounce those calls quickly. But again, to the point of the member's question, we're certainly committed to look at this issue, and around time frames, I'll let her know as soon as I possibly can, as well as all members in this House, what the end result of that review might be. And we'll certainly commit today and forward to having a look at that as soon as we possibly can. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. So many times we sit here and go around and around and around with never an end in sight to an answer. The people in Cape Breton are desperate. I will say I can't implore upon the Minister enough. And regardless of what we're being told about how wonderful things are over the Sunny Bridge, people in Cape Breton need to hear that directly. I implore upon you the importance of your attendance at this meeting, and another one will be coming up. I will ask the Minister again. The meeting is Sunday in the North Side. Will the Minister attend this meeting as my colleagues on the PC side? Please, just yes or no.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows, the Premier and I, as well as my colleagues from Cape Breton, were in Cape Breton in June. We explained to the representatives there what was going to be taking place, Mr. Speaker. That includes investments
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business.